Hey everybody, I'm out here on the banks of the Big East River. You can see behind me this is a really gorgeous spot, and it's a spot that's been kind of special to me the last few months. It's been a place where Kara and I have escaped to go canoeing. It's been a place where I've done some fishing and I've caught trout and bass out of these waters. It's also been a place where I've just come and sat by the river, and I've listened to God, and I've prayed, and I've just thought. And I think it's a real privilege for me to have a place like this, and it's a real privilege to live in a place like Muskoka where we're close to so much water. And I think it's such a privilege because there's something amazing about water. It's something that speaks right to our soul. It brings life and it brings beauty, and it's nourishing and refreshing. I've actually got a friend who has a tattoo, and it's just a tattoo of waves on her arm, and she has that because she connects so deeply with water. I think this is a way that people have always felt about water. I think one way that I know that is because it comes up in scriptures way back in the Old Testament. People talk about water, and they use water to describe things of God, because just like water, I think God speaks directly to the soul. And I want to speak about one of those cases today. I want to talk about a scripture verse from Ezekiel 47, where we read about this really cool vision that Ezekiel has of a river coming out of the temple of God. But before we read that, I want to give you a little bit of background on Ezekiel. He was an Old Testament prophet, and like many of the other Old Testament prophets, his writings kind of have three different parts to them. So the three parts of Ezekiel's writing are starting off with talking about how Israel has strayed from God, and how because of that they're in this time of exile. And then he moves on to talk about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which was super important to the people at that time, and their relationship with God in a lot of ways revolved around that temple. And then he finishes with the third part of his writing, which is talking about how God will redeem his people, and how he will restore a relationship with his people, and how he will create his perfect kingdom here on earth. And this is the part of his writing where we encounter Ezekiel 47 and the message about this river. I want to go ahead and read this passage about this river for you. Just to give you a little bit of context, Ezekiel is being visited by a man in a vision. This is a man that's come from God, and he's taken him to Israel, and he's showing him this rebuilding of the temple there, which has a deep symbolical significance to him. Okay, I'm going to read from Ezekiel 47, and as I do, try to picture what Ezekiel was seeing in this vision. Try to picture the river for yourself. It's kind of a long passage, so I encourage you to go back and check it out yourself later. The man brought me back to the entrance of the temple, and I saw water coming out from under the threshold of the temple towards the east. The water was coming down from under the south side of the temple, south of the altar. He then brought me out to the north gate and led me around the outside to the outer facing gate facing east, and the water was flowing from the south side. As the man went eastward with a measuring line in his hand, he measured off 1,000 cubits, and then led me through the water that was ankle deep. He measured off another 1,000 cubits, and led me through the water that was knee deep. He measured off another 1,000, and led me through water that was up to my waist. He measured off another 1,000, but now it was a river that I could not cross, because the water had risen and was deep enough to swim in, a river that no one could cross. He asked me, "Son of man, do you see this?" Then he led me back to the bank of the river. When I arrived there, I saw a great number of trees on each side of the river. He said to me, "This water flows towards the eastern region and goes down into the Jordan Valley, where it enters the Dead Sea. When it empties into the sea, the water there will become fresh. Swarms of living creatures will live wherever the river flows. There will be a large number of fish, because this water flows there and makes the salt water fresh. So where the river flows, everything will live. Fishermen will stand along the shores. From En-Gedi to Englim, there will be places for spreading nets. The fish will be of many kinds, like the fish of the great sea, but the swamps and the marshes will not become fresh. They will be left for salt. Fruit trees of all kinds will grow on the banks. Their leaves will not wither, nor their fruit fail. Every month they will bear, because the water from the sanctuary flows to them. The fruit will serve for food, and their leaves for healing." So this is a really beautiful image. We see that everywhere the river flows, it brings immense life, and it brings prosperity. it talks about flowing into the Dead Sea, which is a place that Kara and I have been and swam in, and it definitely lives up to his name. Nothing is alive there. And it's actually 34% salinity, just an interesting fact, which is 10 times that of any ocean. So no fish can survive there, but it's pretty cool to think about this river flowing into that place, and despite how salty it is, just bringing life. And maybe the best part, of course, for me would be that there's amazing fishing throughout the whole river. So this is a beautiful image, but what is it? What is meant by it? What's symbolized here? I think the answer can come by looking back in Ezekiel to Ezekiel 43, where he talks about the presence of God entering into the temple, the presence of God and his spirit entering into the temple, in the exact place where we hear that the river is flowing out of. So I think that what that tells us is this river symbolizes God's presence. It symbolizes God's glory flowing out from the temple. It symbolizes, in some ways, God himself and his love flowing outwards to everyone. So just as rivers all over the world flow out and bring life wherever they go, this cool vision in Ezekiel shows us that God's glory and his spirit, wherever it goes, brings life. One of the things I love about this passage, which you might not notice from the get-go, is that it talks about how the river starts as this trickle under, coming from the temple, and then it grows out and becomes this rushing river as it leaves the temple. And something that's cool about that is there's no tributaries, right, feeding into this. It's just prospering and becoming boundless and becoming greater as it goes out. It's being multiplied. And I think this says something really powerful about God. It says something really powerful about God's spirit and God's love, that even though it emanates from one place, it's boundless and it can multiply to no end. There's a cool John Muir quote which I think captures this in a really beautiful way that I'd like to read for you. We all flow from one fountain soul. All are expressions of one love. God does not appear and flow out only from narrow chinks and round-bored wells here and there in favored races and places, but he flows in grand undivided currents, shoreless and boundless, over creeds and forms and all kinds of civilizations, and peoples and beasts, saturating all and fountainizing all. I think that quote is just amazing, and I think it shows to me just how amazing it would be to live along the river of God. Obviously this is a metaphor, right? But think about everything you would have if you were a person who just lived along the banks of the river of God. What are the things that we read about it providing for us? We read that it brings provision, right? We read that it brings healing. We know that it could bring purpose. We know that it causes us to bear fruit, to be fully alive, and also to have awesome fishing, which I think is important. So it sounds pretty cool to live on the banks of the river of God, but obviously that's not a real river that we can just go and set up camp on and catch as many fish as we want, as much as I'd love that. But it is something that I think we can use, some wisdom that we can use. And one thing that I think can help us understand it more practically is to look at another prophet's writing. And I want to look at the prophet of Joel, because he writes in the same way about God's plan to reconcile with his people, but he says something in a little bit of a different way. In Joel 3:18 he says this: "In that day the mountains will drip new wine, and the hills will flow with milk. All the ravines of Judah will run with water. A fountain will flow out of the Lord's house, and will water the valley of acacias." So in Joel's writing he uses this phrase, new wine. He says new wine is coming from the mountains during this time of redemption. And I think this is pretty neat because Jesus also talks about new wine. Jesus teaches a parable, and it's recorded in a few of his Gospels, and I won't read it directly for you, but the parable's simple. He says, you can't put new wine into old wineskins because they'll burst and it just won't work. You have to put new wine into new wineskins. And obviously Jesus wasn't just giving us friendly winemaking tips, right? He wasn't just letting us know that if you put new wine into a new wineskin, it has the ability to expand as the wine creates gas while fermenting. What he was trying to do was teach something. He was trying to teach that We don't have the ability to receive him and to receive his new ways if we're stuck in our old rigid systems. When he was talking to the disciples at this point, he was talking to them mostly about the rigid system of Judaism and the social system that had created, the religious system that had created, because it seemed like they had a tendency to want to try to fit what he was doing into that. Obviously for us, it's a little bit of a different thing. We're enabled to accept Jesus and accept Jesus' way, not because of, for most of us, not because of rigid Judaism, but because of the other ways of being, the other systems of living that we've committed ourselves to. And Jesus is trying to say that you can't hang on to all that stuff and still accept everything that I have for you. So Jesus came to earth as God's Son, and he came for a few reasons, right? He came so he could teach us about who God was. He in fact was God in the flesh. And he came to show God's love to us, and he came also to sacrifice himself for our sins so that we could be forgiven, so that we could be in a right relationship with God. And I think that this is really key to understand when we're talking about Ezekiel's writing, because in all seriousness, Ezekiel was writing about Jesus, even though he might not have known it. In the third part of his writing, of his prophecies, when he was writing about God redeeming his people, and when he was writing about God creating a relationship with his people, restoring relationship with his people, and creating a new kingdom here on earth, a perfected kingdom in his name, he was talking about Jesus. He was talking about the thing that Jesus would later come and do. So if we want to understand Ezekiel's writings, and we want to understand what it means to live a life on the river of God, on the banks of the river of God with our roots down deep, we actually have to look to Jesus, because he's the key to understanding that. I think Jesus helps us in this understanding with some of his other teachings. A couple other teachings that come to mind for me is when Jesus says that we need to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. Another teaching is when he says that we need to be reborn into his kingdom, into his new way of life. What is Jesus trying to say in these things when he's talking about our minds being transformed and being reborn? I think what we need to learn from these scriptures that talk about the renewing of our minds, or that talk about us being reborn into a new life, is that we need to leave behind the old mindsets that we have, the old habits that we have, the old ways of being, the old systems that we live by, if we want to be like new wineskins, if we want to be receptive to everything that Jesus has to offer us. And remember, the things that Jesus has to offer us are pretty amazing, right? He can offer us purpose. He can offer us love, grace, mercy. He can offer us a chance to feel alive, to have purpose, to have a mission, to be accepted. It's boundless, the things that he offers, but in every place that we choose to trust something else, that we choose to attach ourselves to something else, to rely on something else, we're more like an old wineskin in that area, and we will be unable to accept everything Jesus has for us. So if we want to answer that question from earlier of how do we plant ourselves on the river of God, how do we live a life on the river of God, we need to leave behind everything else and rely fully on God and trust fully in God. If we choose to plant ourselves elsewhere, if we choose to hold on to those old ways of being, all we're going to be is trees that are watching the river flow by and bring abundance to other places, not being able to be a part of it. So I think that's my big invitation to you today, is to think about the ways in which you're relying on something else, you're trusting in something else other than God and other than God's Spirit and what he can provide for you. I think if we want to root ourselves more on the river of God, if we want Jesus to be our guide, our healer, our provider, our source of mercy and love and worth, the thing that gives us a purpose, that gives us a mission, the thing that gives us everything, we need to do something to create that change. And the first thing I think we need to do is to start praying. We need to pray to Jesus and say, like, Jesus, I want you to be these things for me. I want you to be where my trust is, the thing I rely on. But beyond just praying, I think we need to do something to create that concrete change in our life. do something to put a marker in the ground, to draw a line in the sand, do something with our actions to back up the prayer that we've just prayed. This looks different for everyone, of course. If you're just now learning about Jesus and you're just now interested in that new life with him, I think the greatest thing that you can do is start telling people that you have this interest. It starts with a prayer of saying to Jesus, like, I want what you have for me. I want you to come into my life. I want to accept the forgiveness that you bought for me on the cross. I want you to come and change everything. Forget these old ways of being, these old systems, these old habits that I was stuck in. Come and change all that. And then tell somebody you've done that and allow them to help walk you through the next steps in your life. Maybe you've already done that, but maybe you're looking to do something to really make this concrete because you've decided this is the kind of life you want to live, a life planted on the river of God, but you've never been baptized. I think that's a great way to make a concrete action and expression to show, like, this is something I want. All you need to do to be baptized, honestly, is just to contact me or contact somebody else you know would be willing to do it. I know we're in the midst of a difficult time right now with this virus, but we can find a way to do that in a way that's safe. For some of you, it might be something that's a little bit different. A concrete change that you might need to make might be, rather than stepping into something, it might be stepping away from something. There may be a person or a relationship that you know you need to step away from. There may be a place that you keep returning to that you know you need to abandon, that you know you need to stop going. Maybe you need to start a new rhythm in your life, something that can keep you focused on God, something that can keep you running to him to find water and stop you from running elsewhere in the places you used to go to try to find water. If you're looking for suggestions on something like that, volunteering, taking your time and putting it somewhere can be an amazing thing. We have places you can do that here at church. If you email me, I can tell you. There's places all over our town, all over our world where you can jump in and volunteer in a cool way. Maybe this means entering into a relationship that's intentional, joining a small group or joining some sort of one-on-one discipleship. You can contact Nikki at our church. Her email's on the website, and she can get you involved in any of that. We're still finding ways to do that even in the midst of this pandemic. Maybe you need to just explore what it is you want to do. Maybe you have this desire, but you don't know what the concrete change is. I would encourage you to reach out to Jeremy or to myself or somebody that you trust and spend some time with them. Maybe it's over Skype, just seeking the Lord together and finding what God is calling you to, finding the way that God wants you to further root yourself in him. I think there's a lot of things that we could do, but I hope that in some way all of us will make that choice to trust God more, to rely on him more, and to leave behind our old systems, the old things that we were stuck in that prevented us from fully accepting everything that God had to offer. In order to help you think about this, I want to ask you a few different questions to close. A few different questions that can help you think through what you rely on, what you trust. I got a few questions written here, and I'll have them written out for you on the video as well. I want you to ask yourself first this. In your culture, what things are particularly challenging to trust God with or to rely on God for? In a metaphorical sense, in what ways does your culture really like to root itself elsewhere rather than on the bank of God? The second, what about your generation? How about your family of origin? In what ways is it a challenge for them to trust God, to rely on God for all things? And after you've asked yourself about those three things, your culture, your generation, your family of origin, then I want you to turn it more inward and say, do you experience some of the same trust and reliance issues that any of those three things have? Is any of that transferred into your life? And how? How does that materialize itself in the way that you live? Maybe there's something that doesn't have anything to do with your culture, your generation, or your family, but there's something that you specifically find difficult to trust God with or to rely on God for. Try to think of what that might be. Try to think of how that looks in your life, how it manifests itself in your life. As you think through all those questions, I want to remind you all the things that God seeks to provide, all the things that you can get if you're rooted on the river of God. Provision, self-worth, identity, mission, purpose, love, a sense of being alive, forgiveness, joy, peace. And there's a lot more things. But keep those things in mind when you're answering those few questions. Okay, I'm going to pray to close. But I also encourage you to check out a song called Tree. It's written by Justin Rizzo, and it talks about being rooted along the banks of the river of God. I have that song along with lots of others along this theme in a Spotify playlist that's called River of God Songs. So if you just go to Spotify.com and you search River of God Songs, you can find that playlist. And it might be something that's interesting to play while you think through these questions and to play while you pray to God about this stuff. Thanks for tuning in. Let me just bless you really quickly. Jesus, thank you for these people who are tuning in and listening to this video. I pray that you would be with them and that you would draw them to yourself, that they would be like new wineskins ready to accept the new wine that you have through Jesus. I pray all this in your name. Amen.